So we're good to go? Wonderful.
Clear the throat.
Yeah. Here we go. Well, hello. Welcome to mackCHAT. My name is Mackenzie, and I'm the host of mackCHAT. This is episode 3 of the series that I'm doing on the art and science of collaboration. And with me today, we have our first guest of the podcast, Dr. Liz Robertson. Yay! Clap, clap. Yes, yes.
It's so great to be here. Thank you for inviting me to your podcast.
Of course, of course. So, for those of you who maybe haven't seen the past couple episodes yet, just a quick recap. The idea of this podcast came to me in the time that I've been doing of developing my business. And really, I have been honing in on how people can work better together, work better to come up with ideas, solve problems, develop solutions, etc. How do we do that better, more effectively, etc.? And so the idea of collaboration has been on my mind for a while. So I thought to myself, why not start talking about it and talk about it with people that I love and know well, and dear friends of mine like you, Liz, that are experts in certain areas around the art and science of collaboration. And so the art is sort of how we show up and collaborate, the nuances that we bring, whether it's our style, our communication style, the actual creativity component of collaborating, and then the science are sort of all of the processes and frameworks and sort of the mechanisms that are happening between the people when they do that. Because collaboration happens whenever there's 2 or more people. So with this podcast, the first 2 episodes, I kind of gave an introduction, talked about some bigger topics and concepts, so go check that out to get sort of a precursor to this. And then the idea is that the coming episodes, including today's episode, we will dive into specific concepts around the idea of collaboration or specific topics in which collaboration will have some sort of nuance to it. And so, so I'm excited to have you here, Liz.
I'm very excited to be here.
Yay.
Honored to be your first podcast
And
guest.
I should say Dr. Liz. Anytime I don't say Dr. Liz, just slap me and and I'll remember. But I've known Dr. Liz for...
You can just call me Liz. I am a doctor, but
I need
you're
the
a friend.
permission.
You can call me Liz. Absolutely.
Okay. I've known Liz now since, oh my goodness, I actually don't know what year it was. Was it 2014?
Summer of 2015.
2015.
Yeah.
So wow, almost 10 years now. And we worked in residence life together. And since then we've been friends. And then within the last year, we've kind of reconnected and had a blossom again in our friendship with your husband, Brad, and my fiance, Joey.
Good people, quality people. Make us better people for sure. Yes.
People. Love it. Soundbite that. So maybe just a brief introduction for people who don't know you. Liz just completed her PhD in Global Leadership and Change from Pepperdine Graduate School of Education and Psychology. So congratulations.
Thank you very much. It was really exciting to do the program, and it's also very exciting to be done with the program.
I'm sure. And you also have your master's in organizational leadership as well. I do. Correct. Okay. And then really your work experience for the past 20 years has been working with young and emerging leaders.
Yes,
right?
In several different capacities, but a lot of preparing young leaders to be graduating from college and then entering the workforce and preparing them to do that well.
I love it. So tell us maybe a little bit more about yourself. Obviously I've just hit a couple of the main points, but maybe tell us of kind of where you've been, where you are now, and kind of where you're headed and what your life looks like right now.
Great. Okay. Well, I have a huge heart and passion for education. And I believe so strongly that education is the work of justice. It's part of what makes us healthy people. It's part of preparing us to be contributing citizens in the world, part of caring about the people around us. And so I have spent all my professional career specifically working in education, preparing young people to enter the workforce, to grow and become the kind of people they want to be, and being a part of their journey. And so for me, I've just very recently left higher education, which was a big huge shift for me because that's been so much my home. I would even say it's probably been a part of my identity of finding a sense of being known, feeling safe in that environment. And I'm embarking on a new adventure with my husband. We've started our own business, and I'm going to be working on how can I help different businesses and organizations do a better job working with the up to 5 different generations who are working together in the same organizations, and recognizing specifically, if you're anywhere on the news, if you've been on TikTok, you've probably seen things about Gen Z. Some of them some of them are less than flattering, some of the things you may have heard. And so I'm really interested in helping organizations do a better job with Gen Z. How do they bring them into work? How do they train them? How do they prepare them to contribute and be really successful at work? And I think there's a lack of knowledge and understanding about Gen Z. And so I want to help fill in those gaps. And that's what I'm really excited about and passionate about.
I love it. And that's what you focused on in your PhD program, right?
Yeah. So in my dissertation, I was really interested in how can I take the knowledge and experience that I have working directly with members of Gen Z and then learn more, do some original research, and help, I think, myself and others understand who is Gen Z. We hear a lot about them, but to actually do deep dive into the research, what's already out there, where's the gap in the research? What are the things that we still need to know? And so I focused, a full year of my life in reading everything I could about Gen Z, lots of books, lots of articles, a few things in pop culture, and then really getting a comprehensive view of who's Gen Z and where are they located just in our larger society and with the generations that are currently existing.
I love it. And so the dissertation, which I did take a look at, fantastic, by the way.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
It's called A Preliminary Exploration of the Workplace Expectations of Generation Z Amidst COVID-19. So very fascinating, very long.
Yes. The title was very long. It was longer, and then we cut it back to that. It was like too many words,
but
too
it's
much.
So many important things that you're discussing, and that, we've had some conversations before this.
Yeah.
And we had to even stop ourselves from continuing to talk because let's save it for the podcast.
We could talk about this stuff all day. It's just who we are. It's what we care about.
And people can pay us for it.
Yes,
which
they
is pretty
can.
fantastic.
Even better. Yep. Yep.
And so, this was important to me because when it comes to collaboration, specifically in the workplace. And that's this podcast, I reference the workplace most of the time, but I do a little, some asides here and there to say this also matters to you in your relationships, your friendships, your family, whatever it may be, any community groups that you're a part of, anywhere you go. I mean, there's really, as you said before, at this point, there are up to 5 working generations in any given organization.
Yep.
And I think you're probably even more likely to interact with 5 generations out in the wild or wherever it may be.
6 if we're including the youngest generation of Gen Alpha, who's coming up right now.
That's the one coming up. Okay. So what are the generations that are working together?
Yep.
And then maybe we can dive in specifically into Gen Z, specifically learning about what has shaped them, what their attitudes, beliefs are, because my understanding, which I picked up from your dissertation, is that by the year 2030, close to every entry-level position in companies are going to be filled by Gen Zers.
Absolutely.
Is that correct?
And even with research that has come out I'm going to say a great thing about research that's come out. Don't worry.
Yeah. No,
Hold
that's
that
fine.
thought. What's actually happened just in the last couple of months is that there are already there are more members of Gen Z in the workforce than baby boomers. And I think that takes a lot of people by surprise because there is a perception that it's all baby boomers in the workforce. But the reality is, looking at the numbers, they have actually just crossed over, and there's now more members of Gen Z in the workforce than there are
if you had to give if we had a pie chart and you had to give a percentage just based off of your guess, how much would you say? And also, let's go back. What are the 5 different generations?
You know what? Let's start at the beginning. Let's start with what we're going to put a couple qualifiers on this because I have to just acknowledge the doctoral nerd hat real quick. So we'll be a little specific.
Let's put it on.
So when we think about generations, every country has different dividing years of what they call generations, as well as different events that have shaped generations. So there may be a term that we would use in the United States, but a different country would call people of that same age something different.
Got it.
So I'm looking specifically with modern generations in the United States. We're going to start with the Traditionalists. They've also been called the greatest generation, who we often think about with world wars. This is a group who was born around 1925 to about 1944.
Okay.
Okay, following that, and I call this group the Traditionalists.
Okay.
They embody a lot of the traditional values. So following them is another generation that if you have been anywhere on the internet or you've seen TikToks, you've probably heard things about baby boomers,
Yes,
right?
I know a few.
So baby boomers were born around 1945 till around 1964.
Okay.
So if you think about that, that's 20 years. That's a pretty big, like, set of years for an entire generation. And it's, I think, important to note that baby boomers who were born between kind of 1945 and 1955 had a really different experience than baby boomers who were born between like 1955 and 65, just based on were they part of the whole like free love and Woodstock and all of that. They had very, very different experiences. Following them is the generation that's known as Generation X, also called Gen X.
Okay.
This is a group that was born from around 1965 to 1979. They're a smaller generation. There's not as many of them as there were baby boomers. But if you talk to anybody who's part of Gen X, they are incredibly nostalgic. This is the group of people that if you're talking about childhood is going to start saying things like, we used to run outside unsupervised all the time. We would drink out of garden hoses. We were allowed to ride bikes with our friends and didn't have to come home until the street lights came on.
Right.
They were the first to be all into things like Atari, MTV, like a lot of technology. And they're very proud of that. So even now when you talk about them, there's so much nostalgia for what their childhood was.
Got it.
So following that is what the millennial generation,
right,
born from around 1980 to 1995. Large in numbers, there's a lot of millennials, and they were known as being a very protected generation. I think there were some unflattering things said, like the idea that everyone who's a millennial gets a trophy and they never had to try anything.
Which we
and everything was handed to them. And they were the first generation to experience things like school shootings. The terrorist attacks of 9/11 were known as the defining moment for that generation. So millennials have been through a lot. They've also, the older millennials who were born kind of in the early 80s are part of a really special group who grew up and had a childhood that was analog and then had to adjust to adulthood that was digital. Which we can talk about the role of technology at any point.
Right.
So then following them, we have a wonderful generation known as Generation Z.
Love them.
And they were born from around 1996 to 2010. So that puts them right now in the age bracket of around age 15 to 29. So if you think about a lot of the youngest people in the workforce, that is this generation.
Got it.
So that's a quick overview, but we can give a shout out to Generation Alpha,
right?
Who is a generation born, after 2010.
2010. Okay.
And this is a group who right now is also being referred to by some generational theorists as polars because they're growing up in such a polarized generation. So there's a lot. We have yet to see what's going to happen with this generation,
Right. Yeah. But it's very likely, because then the oldest of that generation would be about 14 right now. So it's likely they could be watching this podcast.
They could be watching this. They could be starting to have part-time jobs. Like there's just some different things. So, and even if they aren't in the workforce, I guarantee people in the workforce have kids, have family members, have friends who are part of that generation as well.
Right. I love it. So full transparency, I'm kind of the cusp of millennial Gen Z. I'm 1993. So I'm kind of at the tail end of millennial, but sort of because Gen Z starts in 1996.
Right.
So it's like I like to say I get the best of both worlds.
And you know what? I don't want to brag too much, but I also identify as a cusper between Gen X and millennials. So does it make us better than other people?
Fellow
Probably.
cuspers. Yeah.
And I would also say one of the really great things about being a cusper is that you kind of have a foot in both generations, and people who are on the cusp are vital to the workforce because they're great mediators between different generations.
I love that.
So I think sometimes they're misunderstood. They might say, I don't really feel like I identify with that generation, but they have an understanding of how both work. And so figure out who those people are in the workforse. They're going to be a key to success.
I love that. Yeah. And so maybe before we dive into Gen Z specifically, I kind of want to just talk about the importance of having multiple generations in the workforce because, what I'm hearing a lot these days, and I think all of us are hearing to some degree, is that it's just chaos because you have varying perspectives on how work should be done, how you should even do meetings, how
Absolutely.
you communicate, etc.
Should you get to wear jeans to work, or should you wear a 3-piece suit?
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. So there's so much there that you can't escape it. You can't ignore it. It's there. And I think whether or not you choose to prioritize developing it and tuning into it and having conversations around it will kind of determine your level of success in navigating that.
And I'm really glad you brought that up, because I do think, when I've had conversations with people about Gen Z, often what I will hear are things that are complaints.
Right,
You read a news headline and it says, nobody wants to work anymore. This Gen Zer showed up to their accounting job in leggings. There's things, and it's really fascinating, because the reality is, whether or not older generations like it or prefer it, it just is.
It just is.
They exist. They've been shaped by the technology that's been a part of their lives. They've been shaped by everything happening in culture and pop culture. And so I'm going to show my cards a little bit. I loved the TV show Ted Lasso. Did you have an opportunity to watch it?
No, but we talked about it last time we were together too.
So
and it's on the top of my list.
I'm going to give a little shout out, because first of all, it is a masterclass in leadership.
Okay.
To watch and understand, there's a lot there. So we're just going to leave that there.
Love it.
But there's this great moment in the show where Ted is referring to a quote that was originally made famous by the poet Walt Whitman.
Okay.
And he says, "I'd rather be curious than judgmental." And when I think about different generations, when I think about any element of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in the workplace, coming from a place of curiosity instead of judgment is huge. Because if I am in a space of judgment, I'm not actually going to be open to learn. I'm not going to be asking questions, and I'm not going to really care to get to know other people, who they are, what they care about, what their motivations are. I'm just going to sit like with my judgy pants on, right? When I'm in a space of curiosity, I'm open to learning. I'm open to being wrong. I'm open to trying things a new way. And I think that the more that we can have that perspective when we talk about generations in the workplace, the healthier we're going to be.
Exactly. And ultimately, that's healthy collaboration right there.
Absolutely.
Where you're coming in and you're realizing that you're coming in with your own set of whatever it may be, curiosities, opinions, experience, assumptions, expertise. And so when you come and collaborate together on an idea, and I've been talking about this with Joey, is that you also have to come together with the realization that you may be wrong, or you might have or you might make a decision that is maybe not the right decision or the best decision. But if you come together as a group with that commitment together, typically that makes the process better for everyone in the long run. And this reminds me too of a quote that you have. It's actually from, it was on page 51 of your dissertation.
Wow. Okay. Tell me more.
There's this quote from Orwell.
Yes. Oh, this is a great one.
And it's, each generation imagines itself to be more intelligent than the one who went before it and wiser than the one that comes after it. But this is an illusion, and one should recognize it as such.
There's some serious wisdom in those words.
I love that. And I think that for me, and I think for a lot of our other, fellow friends or colleagues who are really driven by connection and connecting with people, and probably lean more on the curiosity side as opposed to the judgment side, probably feel this really hard because they sense it, but they're sensitive enough to people's complaints about it that they get frustrated when people complain. So I think this quote was just a really great reminder of that.
Whenever I would read this quote or I talk about it with people, I would think about the fact that I'm not above that. I for sure think that I'm smarter than my parents.
Sure.
And I also think that even though there's younger generations, I have so much more wisdom and experience. But then realizing everybody thinks that. And so while there are things that are new, that are different about Gen Z, a lot of the realities of the generation gap, which we can jump into at some point if you want to talk more about the generation gap and Margaret Mead, just give her a little shout out, that ethnographer. When we think about that, it's not new to be surprised or confused or concerned about the newest generation because they're different. And often different seems scary because it's unknown. And so the things that we can do to demystify that and to normalize that it's okay to feel uncertain and to want to learn more is going to be helpful in the workplace.
Yeah, I think that is a good transition because we're talking about, all the generations currently in the workplace that are working together, the importance of that. And I will also say that while there are probably more challenges that come with this than we're used to in the past, I think there's also more opportunity and more of an impact that can happen in businesses when you have such diverse backgrounds, understandings, expertise.
Absolutely.
And I think that for younger generations, younger than traditionalists or baby boomers, you also have to recognize that there needs to be some knowledge transfer, knowledge sharing, which I think you talk a lot,
Yes.
or you talk about it in your dissertation. But, we also do have to work with older generations in order to understand how things have been done in the past, in order to better direct us in either, changing those things or enhancing them, whatever it may be, or transitioning them into digital spaces, whatever it may be. So it's incredibly important. So yeah, you mentioned the generation gap, and there's also the problem of generations. Do those two go hand in hand? Can we talk about both, or do we talk about one of those maybe?
So maybe we'll start with the problem of generations, referring to Mannheim. Okay. So Mannheim was a German sociologist.
Okay.
And he is responsible for the overall idea of generational identity being a thing.
Okay.
And so what was unique about his approach, he was looking at his own context in Germany, but he likened generational identity to being something like social class. So it's something that is socially constructed, but it forms a part of who you are based on the events that you've experienced, what's happening in government, are there wars, what's happening in culture. And so making sure that generational identity is actually a facet of what makes people who they are. So he is known as the father of generational theory. So I would say we start with him, and I would say most generational theorists do.
Okay.
Now, the generation gap, on the other hand, was really, we give credit to Margaret Mead, who was an ethnographer, and she wrote a book called The Generation Gap about said generation gap.
Yep.
Makes sense. And what's really fascinating is that she was looking at what was happening with the gap occurring between the traditionalists and baby boomers.
Okay.
And when you read her book, if you ever do, I pulled a couple of her quotes that are in my dissertation.
Yes.
She writes things that sound like they were written in 2024 about younger generations looking at older generations. And if you did not know when it was written, you would think somebody just wrote this.
Right.
Like, I'm watching this older person in my life bumbling, like trying to use an iPhone or trying to convert this Word document to a PDF, and they don't know what they're doing. And at the same time, she made the identification that today's young people have grown up in a world that their elders have never experienced.
Right.
And so recognizing there's a disconnect that happens each way. But you know what? There's been a generation gap with every new generation that comes into our world. What's really unique about Gen Z is that there are generational researchers who are almost referring to them as they're not just a generation gap, there's a generation lap, as in that they are surpassing other generations. Now, older generations might hear that and get a little defensive.
Right. I'm like, surpassing?
Yeah.
Like they're beating me? Yeah.
What that's really referring to is the amount of information that they have access to, technology, and how much it's sped up change.
Yes.
And so it's less about they're so much more advanced. It's saying that the significance of that gap is really great. It's the largest that we've had in modern history.
Wow. Yeah. And you also mentioned how there's an authority that comes with that. So, and I think that's also where older generations can be sensitive to it, become, frustrated, is that, there is now this younger generation that has authority over technology and how business is being conducted.
Yep.
So it's almost like we're dependent on them.
Yeah.
And so we almost have to give up our...
There's a huge power shift that's happening.
Wow.
And when I reflect, if I may share a personal anecdote.
Sure.
When I was growing up, the internet existed, but it certainly was not in homes until I was in high school. And even then it was a modem and very limited access to internet. So I grew up in a family where we had a whole set of Encyclopedia Britannicas. And if I had a question, something I wanted to know more about, I might ask my parents. And if they knew, they would give me the answer. And if not, I would march over to those encyclopedias. I would look them up. I would do a little bit of reading. And so there was a sense that knowledge and authority were outside me, and I needed another person, somebody who had a lot of experience to get that information from. Well, what's happened now is the entire world, all the information in the world is in your hand. Yeah. It's in your pocket.
Right.
And so younger generations come off as disrespectful because they have access to the information, and there's not the same default respect for authority or experience. And when you think about that in a workplace context, that can feel threatening to older generations.
100%.
And so I think understanding, oh, that's what's behind that. It's not personal. It's just a reality of they've grown up being able to Google or use YouTube and figure things out doing WikiHow and a variety of other sources. The amount of information that you can get even on TikTok. So they're able to see. Now, is all the information they're getting accurate?
Right. I was going to say there's some cons to this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Cautionary tale. Don't believe everything you see or hear on the internet.
Right.
So
unless it's on this podcast.
Absolutely.
It's all 100% true, accurate.
Truth. Yes. Yeah. We fact check over here. Okay. Right. But there is a reality of helping younger generations learn how to discern what are credible sources.
Right.
That's so great that you saw TikTok. Is that actually credible?
Right.
Is it an academic journal? Is it peer reviewed? Or is it somebody's opinion that they wanted to do a funny video and now we're taking this as truth?
Right. That's really interesting. I'm trying to think. Yeah, there's pros and cons to that in the workplace. And I think I can be sensitive and understand from the older generations. Because the thing is, and maybe I'll point this out too, because I don't know that we've voiced this yet, is that baby boomers are still in the workplace, and actually their years of retirement are being pushed further down the road.
Absolutely.
Whether that's because they're living longer and are healthier longer, and many of them are committed to work and have really strong work ethic, and so they want to stay in the company, they want to stay working. I know several people who have retired and ended up going back to work after retirement.
Coming out of retirement, here we go, back at it. We're back in the office.
And then also with that, so it's both them living longer, but then also there's such a big population that are needing to work because they need money, because they're having a hard time making a living. And so they are, I guess for lack of better terms, like forced to continue working. And I think there are people who envision that they would be retired by now.
Absolutely.
And
had dreams. They've worked for decades on the promise that, hey, the system would work for them.
Yep.
They, lived the American dream. They did their education. They worked really hard, and they've stayed faithful to their company. And all of a sudden they're 65.
Right.
And they can't retire.
Right.
And probably some feel a little duped.
Yeah.
And discouraged by that. And so they're continuing in the workplace because they need to survive.
Because they need to.
Yes.
And then now you also are faced on top of that with having to change how you work.
Absolutely.
Change who you interact with.
Yes.
Adopt the technology and do things that you just don't want to do because, and so I think there's also learnings there for our generations and the generations, younger than us as well, to be in tune to those nuances or that context of the baby boomer generation and even traditionalists, because there's still traditionalists as well.
Yes. And I think, you bring up a really important point, which is that the baby boomers and the traditionalists who are still in the workforce, they have such a wealth of knowledge. And I think there are a lot of opportunities to, like you mentioned, that idea of knowledge transfer. So how do we take not just the hard skills, but just some of here's all this stuff I know because I've worked at this company for 40 years,
right,
that when I leave, no one else knows how to do.
It's not in a manual. It's not,
It's just in somebody's head. And how do we find ways to meaningfully communicate, transfer that knowledge to other generations, bring others up to be developed as leaders? And I also think there's a real shift happening in the workforce, which is part of why maybe Gen Z's entry to the workforce feels a little unsettling. And that's because there's this concept that's called centrality of work, which really has to do with how important is work to you, to your identity, to your sense of who you are. And I would distinguish work from purpose.
Okay.
They can be similar, but I think that often there was such a sense of, this is my job. I've done it for my whole career. I've worked at the same place. I have followed the rules. I have climbed the corporate ladder. I don't know who I am outside of work. And I think that can also feel scary if you have not been thinking about where do I find purpose outside of work? What are the ways I'm going to keep contributing to my family, to my community, to society, even if I'm not in the workforce anymore? And one of the major shifts that's happening is Generation Z is entering the workforce. And they have all these newfangled ideas like, we want to be paid fairly for the work we do.
Right.
And wait a second, I don't want to volunteer to do my job outside of work hours if it's not in my job description.
Right.
And I feel like I should get paid enough to be able to pay rent and have health insurance and buy groceries and gas.
Right.
I shouldn't have to work 2 full-time jobs. And there's also a sense of younger generations are looking up at their parents, at their grandparents, and what they're seeing is, wow, they worked so hard for this company for so long. And then when they were 63, they got laid off, they got eliminated. Their parents had loyalty to these institutions, to these organizations, and the loyalty was one way.
Yeah.
And so they no longer want to commit to just one organization because they don't know that there's going to be the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow when it comes their time to retire. So Gen Z has a really different perspective on the centrality of work. They care about friendship. They care about the world around them. They care about things like climate change, gun control, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. They're so passionate about these things. And when they look at work, they want their work to fit into that. They want to be able to have a life outside of work. They want to have friendships. They want to travel. They want flexibility. And older generations, I think, didn't always give themselves permission to imagine that, to dream that, or to even want that for themselves. So you can see how in a traditional organization, you'd run into a situation where a baby boomer might look down at a member of Gen Z and say, why don't you want to go above and beyond every day?
Right.
Why aren't you volunteering to stay till 10 p.m. to finish work? Well, that's because that member of Gen Z maybe has different boundaries, different expectations about work-life balance.
A different idea of success.
Yes, different values. And that's a huge shift in the workplace.
Yeah, but it makes sense why that might come off as entitlement, maybe to the baby. I've heard that word a lot thrown out there. They're entitled.
Yes. Would you say you're hearing that? Because I've heard that as well in the context of, wow, this kid came in and started working here, and after 2 weeks, they want a promotion.
Right.
Or they want a raise.
And I've worked with that. So in organizations I've been in, we have experienced that. And some of it I can understand. Some of it feels to come all at once. And you can tell that they're talking behind the scenes and coming together as a group.
Yes.
And you start to feel threatened. You start to feel like this is now somehow combative.
Yes.
Even though it doesn't need to be. But now I'm in a position of leadership and I want to, I definitely want to either come to a compromise or even grant that because I believe them. And I say, yeah, I'm looking at the market data and you are correct, but I have partners to appease and who are part of the baby boomer generation, sometimes even traditionalists. And so that was an interesting position I was in, being the middle person between baby boomer partnerships and staff of, millennial Gen Z.
So much mediation in that type of position where you're listening to what are really valid concerns.
Right.
And it's probably an employee that you think, this person is great and I want them to be successful here, but how do I translate their experience to my supervisors to help them understand the value?
Right.
And that can easily
get
lost.
And how do I also communicate to them that I hear you and see you and believe you, but this large of a shift will cause the business to fail because we don't have the resources or we don't have the money.
Yes.
So if you can hold out a little bit, and it ended up just being like a constant negotiation, but, people perceive that differently depending on what side they're on. And so that was just an interesting anecdote there.
That raises...
Yeah. Oh.
Yes.
Okay, so we just had a question from the audience.
Thank you for a wonderful question.
Yes.
And the concept was brought up that maybe it feels like right now Gen Z is getting, we might say, credit for caring about some larger societal issues. And I think it is appropriate to say that's something that really started with members of the millennial generation for a variety of reasons. And I think, as I was mentioning earlier, there's things like, I remember being in high school when the Columbine shooting happened. And I can tell you, I have really different feelings about gun control because I lived through that as a high school student. And I know how terrifying that was. And then I worked in education where we would do active shooter drills. And we actually did one where somebody who was a police officer came in and shot blanks in a classroom we were in. We did a whole simulation, and just recognizing this is what we're putting kids through in school, right? So the millennials really cared about that. I think there was also a larger sense of, and I've said this a little bit as a joke, so go with me for a second. There was the beautiful song by Whitney Houston, I Believe the Children Are Our Future. And I think that at the time, that was a lot of pressure on millennials. Like, we're never going to live up to that. There's no way we can be the future that Whitney, envisioned us to be. And yet there's a greater sense of, I think, camaraderie, even globally, that began with millennials, a sense of connection, understanding what's happening just outside the United States. We want to look at the global world. We care about the fact that we were told there's this whole idea of the American dream, and it seems like we followed the rules and that didn't pan out. And so I do want to say, I do think that millennials have paved a lot of the way for issues that are really important when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they've been really brave in a lot of spaces where it didn't feel safe to do so, where maybe it wasn't safe to do so in the workplace, in families. And so they took some of those first steps that has paved the way then for the Gen Zers coming after them to be able to pick up that momentum.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think it'll be interesting to see the shift in leadership.
Absolutely.
So, because, right now there are definitely some millennials in leadership positions, but a lot of them are kind of critical, like mid-level management, or maybe like junior to senior leadership, but then the partnerships or the board or the C-suite is still largely baby boomer or traditionalist. And so it'll be interesting to see just what shifts happen with whatever it is, values of companies, or not even just the values, but how the values are actually lived out in companies, what meaning looks like, what impact looks like, what benefits are made available. But I also think to add on to your point about, millennials kind of paving the way, I think the digital space had a lot to do with that, because you are I've talked about this with my parents, is that their world is confined to the neighborhood they were in, the church community they were a part of, and the walls around their house.
The circles were very small.
The circles were very small. And so when we were introduced to just how much is out there, I think that the possibilities grew and expanded. And I think that kind of in complementing seeing your parents maybe not having a shared loyalty with their company and being, kicked out at whatever age and not having their plans of retirement, this or that, I think those two together really contributed to the fact that, wow, I think there's a lot of meaning in life that is outside of the workplace. And then I think the pendulum swings the other way to say, I think there's a lot of meaning in life that we need to bring into the workplace. And so I think both of those are probably a good, healthy balance.
Both and.
Yeah.
You brought up the idea of values, and most organizations have a mission statement. They have a vision statement. They have, here's our 5 core values.
Right.
And I want to shout out Dr. Brene Brown, who talks a lot.
We love you, Dr. Brene Brown.
Dr. Brene Brown, we are huge fans if you ever see this. Thank you for changing our lives.
We're going to do something at the end that is actually a riff off of your podcast.
So Brene Brown speaks a lot about the idea of operationalizing values. And I think another real distinctive that's happening with generations in the workplace is that millennials, and then especially Gen Z, really care about transparency, authenticity. And so they're going to have a really difficult time respecting a leader who says, hey, these are our values. We care so much about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there's no one above middle management at this organization who's a person of color or a minority in any way. That disconnect is, I would say, really difficult for younger generations, because again, is the organization embodying the values that they're saying they have? Or is it just I'm going to use a trendy word. Is it just performative? We're going to say this so it sounds like we care about this, but in the way that we interact, in the way that we treat people, in the way we function as an organization, we're not doing that.
Check off the boxes. We're just checking the boxes.
Absolutely. We did that training.
Yeah.
Check.
Right.
And there's such a desire when I was doing my research and looking at Gen Z. I had read this really great quote. A Gen Zer was talking about their experience and said, when I'm looking for a job, your mission statement doesn't need to say that you're going to change the world. We don't care. You don't need to change the world. And also you can't change the world.
Right.
Don't flatter yourself.
Right.
That's really not what you're doing. But what I do care about is an organization that cares about their community, that gives back, where there's opportunities to volunteer, where there are leaders who are emotionally intelligent, who are caring about issues like diversity, who are maybe finding ways to say, could we be more green in our organization? Could we look at solar? Could we do different things? Corporate social responsibility. These are concepts that are really attractive to younger members of the workforce. And so you may think, well, why would somebody want to work there? Well, this company has a great reputation for volunteer work, or they have an amazing corporate social responsibility report. That's a draw for Gen Z, much more than saying, oh, but one of our core values is diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right.
So that disconnect is hard for younger generations. They want to see authenticity. They want to see embodied values.
And they want to see action. So it's like, let's not make them so aspirational. Yes.
Aspirational.
Or inspirational.
Yes. Aspirational and inspirational.
Aspirational. But let's make them actionable,
Absolutely.
There's, and that's to the point of the Gen Zer you're talking about. You can't necessarily change the world. Let's start. You got to start somewhere.
Start somewhere.
I love that. But maybe, how are you feeling?
Right now?
Yeah. Do you need a break? Do you need a drink?
Good.
Do you feel good?
How's the rest of our team doing?
How are we doing? We need a water. Should we do a quick
moment. Let's do a quick
little
break.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Okay, so I would love to go in. Speaking of values,
yes.
I think one thing that would be great to go into is a little bit more about Gen Z, about that generation and their values and what they're bringing to the table in our workplace.
It's a great question. So one of the reasons that I wanted to take a deep dive in research on Gen Z is because I was hearing all these negative things about Gen Z, and my lived experience working with them, supervising them, having meaningful conversations with them was so different than what I was reading on the news or seeing in pop culture. And so part of my heart and my passion is, let's elevate Gen Z so we can really get to know who they are, because my experience with them, there's always some people who are challenging in every generation. Let's be honest.
We know that's right.
We know that's the truth. Gen Z is awesome.
Yeah.
They're capable. They're passionate. They care so much about the world around them. I actually think there is a selflessness to them of, I don't just care about me. How do my actions impact others? How does even things like recycling, climate change, they care about leaving the world better than the way that they found it. And I think that's just something that's important to know about them. They care deeply about others. They are so passionate about justice, about diversity. And I think that should be supported in them. That should be encouraged. I think they're going to lead the way on a lot of really complex issues. And at the same time, there's some challenges to Gen Z because of the way that they have grown up, because of the reality of technology. So starting in about the year 2012, okay, so when the first Gen Zers were kind of small, right?
Sure.
Smartphones were ubiquitous.
Yeah.
That's a fancy PhD word for.
Yeah.
They were everywhere, like everybody had one. So
I love
ubiquitous is
the
just it's all over. And so realizing almost everybody had an iPad, an iPhone.
Right.
And so recognizing they were raised constantly having access to that, which means their view of the world is different. They have had access to so much more information. And so while it may be easy to look at Gen Z and say, oh, they just have really high or unrealistic expectations. The reality is their expectations are different, because their entire world has been different.
Right.
Their entire upbringing has been different. And when we look at the research of people like Jean Twenge, who is one of, out of, I think it's San Diego State University, who is one of the foremost generational researchers. She wrote the book Generations, iGen. She talks a lot about how...
I'm going to pause you real quick.
I wish you would... I believe we have a special guest.
We have a special guest.
Yeah. I would love for everyone to meet the special guest.
Giving us... This is Toshi. Oh, he's on the mic already. This is Toshi. We could say he's our mascot.
I think that's a fair thing. The mascot.
Would you like to contribute anything to the conversation about collaboration? I'm Gen Alpha.
Toshi is Gen Alpha. He is the youngest member of our collaborative team.
Can you explain it for the audience who can't see?
Oh wait, could you really? Oh yeah, oh, right. For those viewers who may be just listening, there is a mini golden doodle in my lap. He's our puppy Toshi.
Adorable.
He wanted to say a quick hello.
Adorable.
So let's get back to, you were talking about, what was her name?
Oh, we were talking about Jean Twenge.
Okay.
Who is a generational researcher. And I think a lot of people are thinking, well, this generation was fine until COVID came along. And then COVID just ruined them. And now they don't have any skills. And the reality is, that's not true. COVID impacted everybody. Were there some unique things because of the age and developmental stage of Gen Z? Absolutely.
Right.
But even before COVID, there's a lot of research indicating that Gen Z is a generation that is growing up more slowly than previous generations. So what does that means,
mean? Yeah.
Yes. So what does that mean? It means that for an 18-year-old who might be entering college, who's Gen Z, they're going to be more like a 14 or 15-year-old millennial at the same stage, meaning their maturity, some of those things are delayed by about 3 or 4 years from the previous generation.
Okay.
So if you think about what's happening, we have individuals who are entering maybe the college, higher education sphere who are coming in with the maturity of a 9th grader from a previous generation. That also means then when that group is perhaps finishing college,
right,
they're 22-ish years old, they're a little bit more like a college freshman, and now they're entering the workforce full time. And then we wonder, why are there gaps in what we assume they know, with their expectations? So that was happening even before COVID. So that's not a result of COVID, that predated COVID. So it's a good thing to know. However, there's also this idea of the maturity principle, which means they're just growing up more slowly. It doesn't mean they're not growing up at all. They're going to get there.
Right.
Their adolescence is prolonged. That has to do with a variety of cultural factors, including parenting. So I feel hopeful for them. It just might be when they're 18, they're not going to be as mature as they will be when they're 28 years old. Okay. Much like I wasn't as mature at 18 as I was at 28. Understood. So I have hope for them. It's just going to take some time to fill in some of those gaps until they reach that maturity.
Got it. Wow, that's fascinating. I didn't know that part. And so if it was happening before COVID, remind me, because I might not be connecting the dots here, but so what was the contributing factor? Was it the digital upbringing? And you said parenting?
This is a great question. Yeah. And I'm going to give another shout out to Jonathan Haidt, who has written several books, including The Coddling of the American Mind, which he wrote with Greg Lukianoff, and then just recently came out with a book, The Anxious Generation, this spring, and really looking at what's happening specifically with mental health when it comes to Gen Z. And there's a lot of factors. There's a lot of things that he posits in his research that he puts forth, saying things like they grew up more focused on phones and technology. Right. They have been more engaged in a world digitally where they've been allowed to experience anything. So this weird flip-flop is happening where they're hyper protected in the real world, and then there's no protection and they're sent out into the digital sphere where they have access to everything. Wow. There's less free play. So they're not learning the same skills of what happens if we're just like on the playground playing and no adult is intervening when we disagree or we need to be creative. They're having less opportunity to gain all those social skills. And so they're not learning, how do I enter into a sphere where there's some sort of stakes in their identity, and do they fit into a group? Because when you're really looking at the internet sphere, you can be part of a group, no barrier to entry, and as soon as you don't like it anymore, you just disappear. You don't get to do that in real life. Right. And so I think some of those impacts have to do with there is a gap in some of the skills socially of sitting and talking and looking each other in the eye.
Right.
Like when I've been talking to you, you've been nodding, you smile,
Right.
you laugh.
Right.
I'm looking at a person. You're
Yes.
not giving me the same expression you would have if you were just staring at a screen.
Right.
And so there's a lot of opportunity. How do we develop the mirroring, some of the social skills, responding in real time?
Right.
I don't have time to compose a text message and then respond. Oh, wait, I'm at work and my boss is asking me in real time what I'm going to do with that.
Right.
And I need to actually formulate a response and
Yes.
say something. I can't draft it and send it later.
Right. And this would be the art of collaboration. That's the art piece of
100%
it, because
the art.
and ultimately there's things happening in the science of it. When you do smile, when you do look someone, dopamine is released,
Yes.
etc. So there is science
Bonding,
to it.
connection,
Bonding,
trust
exactly.
building,
Yeah,
all
yeah,
the
yeah.
things that we know organizations need to be successful.
Right. And I'd say before we jump into the next topic, I'd also say that this then places, whether they want it or not, this places a sense of responsibility on older generations in the workplace to come alongside Gen Z and the incoming generations after that and help with some of these social skills. Because if you think about it, and this was a thought I had recently about how it's fascinating how when you grow up in school, for my generation, millennial, and I would say maybe generations above me, that's where your social skills were developed and continued through college. When you get to the workplace, it's kind of like people don't want to have anything to do with that. You kind of stick in your own, maybe you make some friends at work or coworkers, but everyone's kind of to themselves.
Yes.
But it's like ultimately that's where you're spending the majority of your time is in the workplace. Why are you not continuing to develop your social skills, enhance them?
Yes.
But that's where things do come up, like strengths, doing assessments and things like that.
Yes.
Whether or not companies value that is another thing. But I would say that for Gen Z, there is definitely this unspoken responsibility for the generations above them to have to deal with this, and maybe not have to deal with it in a negative sense, but it is now a facet of how you're dealing with how you're working.
It's a huge opportunity in the workplace. And I think when I did research and interviewed Gen Zers and asked them questions about what are you wanting out of a supervisor in the workforce, and what does your ideal workplace look like? There's a lot of interest in having some sort of mentoring or coaching relationship with a supervisor. So I think another shift that's happening with that is, as a millennial, if I have a supervisor, they might check in with me once every 2 weeks, once a month, and that's great with me.
Right.
Members of Gen Z love more frequent check-ins. They want to know, hey, am I doing okay? Am I on track? It doesn't need to be an hour one-on-one, but having more frequent communication is really important because they're more sensitive to hierarchy. I think they don't love the whole hierarchical structure. They want to be able to approach and ask questions. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for leaders in the workplace to come alongside, but it's going to come at a cost. It's going to take time. It's going to take creativity. It's going to take curiosity to know, how do I get to know this member of Gen Z who's on my team, and how do I bring them in? How do I learn from them? What are the ways that they need to learn? So I think it's a both and. Opportunity for older generations and for Gen Zers who are going into the workplace thinking, hey, the whole workplace environment needs to adapt to my preferences. There is also a reality check of, here's what it means to be professional. Here's what it means to dress professionally, to write a professional email. There's a learning curve there. And so they need to be willing to contribute to the aspirational workplace that they want to be a part of. They have to co-create that. They can't just expect to receive that.
Right.
So the responsibility, I think, goes both ways.
Interesting. Yeah, that's fascinating. It'll be fun to incorporate some of this in the work that we do. Working with organizations on their strategies, on how they are, prioritizing these pieces of it. But a lot of people just don't know. They're not aware. And I think that's the start, is you have to just educate.
Yes.
You have to bring awareness.
Yep.
And I think we're both excited to be a part of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So now maybe we can bring it back into the fold.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Let's fold in the cheese.
Fold it in.
Fold it in.
We love a Schitt's Creek reference. We love a Schitt's Creek reference.
Fold it in.
You fold it. Just fold it.
I can't. My mind is now all like Schitt's Creek references.
You say that like it's a bad thing.
Right. No, we love it.
We love
it. So this podcast series on the art and science of collaboration. So just to recap too, collaboration, the way I define it is it's anytime two or more people come together in order to come up with new ideas, make decisions, problem solve, develop solutions, whatever it may be. And so when it comes to the art of that, that is sort of how we're doing it, whether that's in the digital space, whether it's in person, if it's over a meeting, if you're doing whiteboarding, if you're doing a workshop, whatever. And also the communication styles that come with it, all of that. That's the artistic side of it. That's the art of it. And then there's the science of it. It's all the sort of underlying mechanisms that are happening, whether it's biological, psychological, sociological, neurological, etc. There's a lot of, research that's been done on that for decades as far as just like how we interact with humans. And so kind of thinking of that with the art and science, how would you bring your topic into that model? Yeah,
great question. So when I think about the art and science of collaboration in any workforce and recognizing every workforce is unique. If you're a small nonprofit, if you're a Fortune 500 company, your structure is going to look different. However, I do think that starting with the reality that we're all human beings who deserve dignity in our work. And I think if we start there and say, when I'm working with this person, even though sometimes it's challenging, this is a person who's worthy of dignity. They should be respected. We should have a respectful relationship. I think there's incredible opportunity by being people who are humble and who are curious and want to know more about those we are working with. And I know in my own professional career, when I make assumptions about other people, when I don't believe the best in them, I have a really difficult time working with them.
Right.
When I'm able to be in a space of curiosity and recognizing, oh, wow, that person did that really differently than I would have done it. That's not a bad thing. It's just a different approach. And can I be curious about why they did it that way? Can I be willing to be wrong? When I am wrong, am I willing to say, I'm sorry?
Right.
That's so important. Or to acknowledge, hey, I actually really need help with that. So I think that the more that we can model what it means to be humble and to be curious in the workplace is going to create space and an environment where people can collaborate and actually really enjoy their work.
Yeah, I love that. And how, easier said than done.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. A lot of trial and error there.
Yeah. And I mean, even in my own experience, having conversations like this with other managers, trying to lead people, you have those one-on-one conversations and they're really fruitful, and you walk away thinking, oh my gosh, they understand it now. They understand how to be accountable, how to have ownership, how to commit, how to, whatever it may be.
They nodded their head through the whole meeting. They are on board. Yes.
And then you get into the next group meeting and shit hits the ceiling fan, and and it's like you're back to square one. And I think that's going to be one of the hardest thing in not to like plug my business, but one of the things that we attempt to solve, there's 3 pitfalls in building alignment. And so for those of you who don't know, my business is around like building alignment in strategy, operations, and culture. And so the culture piece of it, there's 3 pitfalls, and that's just limited understanding. People need to understand what it looks like. They need to be educated. They need to be aware. There's lack of resources when it comes to it. And there's learned behaviors. And so people have certain behavioral responses, especially when they're stressed, when they're frustrated, whatever it may be. So it's one of those things that takes time, and it takes a lot of commitment and prioritization and resources. So how do we, this is a question for myself as well.
Yeah.
How do we put an emphasis of prioritization on the importance of curiosity and connection enough that companies will want to budget for it? Or, maybe for, just to throw that out there, say it's that important that they're going to put a budget into it as much as they would into their sales team, as much as they would into, DEI and B, et cetera. Look, what do you think? I don't know. This is it's a big question.
This is the $1 million question, right?
Yeah.
I do think there is a lot of opportunity if those who are in leadership genuinely care about the people they're working with. Kindness is free.
Yeah.
Right? It takes time. It takes effort. It takes humility. I know I've been saying humility a lot, but there's just no space for ego if you want to build the kind of culture that's going to care about the people that you work with.
Right.
And one of the reasons that I love talking about generations specifically is everyone can find themselves in the generation that they're a part of.
Yeah.
It speaks to everyone. And I think it can lower people's sometimes anxiety. They feel seen, they feel known, all those things that create a sense of belonging. Like I have a voice. The things that I say at work matter. People listen to me. Those are things that can help, I think, really build that culture. It also takes an incredible amount of emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, I hear a lot of conversation about technology and AI, and there's incredible things and assets that brings into the workplace, right? It can make systems so efficient.
Right.
And one of the things that AI can't do is actually be emotionally intelligent.
Right.
It can't sit across from you and look you in the eye and support you. And so I think there's all the more reason to invest in our own emotional health and well-being, to see other people around us in a respectful way, to ask questions. And those are things that AI can't do.
Yeah.
And so I think the organizations that really value that model it, leaders who are willing to say, hey, I did this and it was wrong, or it hurt somebody, they will build trust.
Right.
That ability to be authentic, to model those things is huge.
Yeah.
But it is hard.
It's hard. And
it takes time. It takes effort.
Yeah. And it's a big challenge that I think a lot of people in all the way from Gen X, down to Gen Z, generations are passionate enough about to bring it up in conversations, to prioritize it. But I can see how it can be disappointing, discouraging when you don't see it happening.
Yeah.
And I think as long as you keep pushing it forward, those companies that don't prioritize it will eventually fizzle out. Or there will be a switch in leadership or a switch in governance, whatever it may be, to make that happen. Because these conversations aren't going away, especially if Gen Z is so, incredibly invested into it.
Absolutely.
We're going to have to, by 2030, when they're the majority of entry level positions, every company's going to have to respond.
Yeah. And I think, you're bringing up a really important point, and I want to give a shout out to Dr. Santor Nishizaki, who was on my dissertation committee, and he's done a lot of work on generational research as well. He wrote a book called Working with Gen Z, and it's a handbook for how do you recruit them and retain them. So he and I have had a lot of conversations, and I do think one of the realities that I think a lot of organizations don't acknowledge is that it's way more expensive to keep losing employees because you don't know how to onboard them or you don't know how to train them.
Yep.
You have to keep hiring more and more. It takes time. And so it's actually the most cost effective to have meaningful onboarding, to talk openly about expectations, to give people the skills, the training, the resources they need to be successful. They're also going to be more invested. They're going to care more about the end result when they feel cared for at work.
Yeah.
So I do think that as, human resources finds ways to say, how are we being really clear on what we expect from work?
Right.
And things that to you and me might seem, well, of course you need to do that at work, aren't always clear to younger generations. And so we might need to be even more explicit.
Right.
We might need to identify things that you think, do we really need to write in our policy that you shouldn't wear athleisure to work?
Right.
You might actually have to, because it's a given for older generations, but there's an assumption that younger generations know that. So filling in some of those gaps as well.
Right. I remember in my past work, we did some research on it, and it can cost up to 3 times the person's salary to replace them.
Absolutely.
And we know that very well because we're suffering so much. And I think ultimately, if you do save money, you can then put those resources towards HR to develop some more positions that are about social learning in the workplace, whatever it may be. So there's a lot of opportunity there. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Toshi's trying to dig his way out of here. He's over the...
Toshi's had enough of the podcast for today.
But we have not. I think another piece of it, and in my last episode, I talked about this and shouted out Caslee Killam, which I have the book right here, The Art and Science of Connection. So another
Yes.
plug for Casley there. But it's really fascinating because I think because when I think of trying to pitch something like Connection Curiosity
Yeah.
to a board of directors, typically you need to have data, you need to have money in there, you need to
Show
have
me the
statistics,
numbers.
you need
Yes.
to have all of that. And there's so much research that is decades old that shows that connection between humans causes longer living and more healthy lifestyles.
Absolutely.
And so Casley has actually spent her time gathering all of that research because she realized in her work that there was no kind of umbrella term or umbrella concept to involve, loneliness, happiness,
Yes.
all of that. And so she spent a lot of time doing that. And she has now, really pushing for social health is what they're calling it.
Absolutely.
And so it's up there and she kind of throws it in to 3 pillars. There's physical health, mental health, and social health.
I love that.
And I think social health, that piece of it, has to be in the workplace.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
I think if you can kind of, take the charge and incorporate that and prioritize that and put the numbers to it and everything, I think it could have some impact.
It could have significant impact.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I love it. Okay. Well, let's see here. We're just about done,
Okay.
but we have some more questions that I have for you.
Okay.
So, when's the sequel to this dissertation, or what do you have any aspirations to
Yes.
I
Word
said
of
it
the
right
day.
that time, to maybe write a book, or do is there like a bigger study that we could do to get more data? Yeah, what do you have thoughts on that?
That's a great question. I think that as somebody who is an educator, and we know, nerd alert,
Yeah.
I do love researching.
Yes.
So I think whatever I'm doing professionally, I'm going to continue to research and understand and learn. And I think translate experiences and all this like theoretical knowledge into application for others to make it easily digestible, practical, all of that. So for me right now, that looks like, would I love to write a book at some point? Yes, I would. I'm not sure when that will happen yet, but it's on the list of things I would love to do. But in the meantime, I'm really passionate about helping organizations do a better job of managing a multi-generational workforce, and then also specifically how to work with Gen Z, which is both, as we've talked about, helping older generations understand Gen Z and how to work with them, but also preparing members of Gen Z to enter the workforce in a way that they can be successful.
I love that. And so you this year have formed your business,
Yes.
correct? Do you want to take a moment to plug that a little bit?
I would love to. So my husband and I have started an LLC.
Brad. Hey, Brad.
My husband, Brad, biggest supporter. Yes. And a great example of what it means to be a collaborator, somebody who understands so much about teams and how people work together. But it's called the 1014.
Got it. And what does that mean?
Where does the name come from?
Yeah.
So 1014 is our anniversary.
Love it.
So if you have, questions, you want to know more about what does it mean to work with Gen Z? What can we do with our multi-generational workforce? You can hit me up at liz@the1014.com.
I love it.
TEN14.com. And I'd love to connect with you.
1014.
Or you can find me on LinkedIn as well.
I love it.
Yeah,
Great. And we'd love to have Brad on the podcast as well.
absolutely.
So we'll be
Yes.
reaching out to his people. My people will reach out to his people.
Wonderful.
We'll make it happen.
Yeah, that's great.
Maybe we'll just have one big podcast.
We could
with,
do that. Just
yeah.
a big group
Yeah,
podcast.
yeah.
I love that idea. Let's get a few more microphones.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. It'll be
I'm in.
it'll be a Netflix series.
Perfect.
It'll be like
Yes. Let's do it.
Okay, so now we're gonna go into this is the piece that I mentioned earlier is a little bit of a steal from Brene Brown's podcast. She does a little rapid fire question at the end, which is so hard because I feel like they're not quick questions necessarily, but kind of like whatever comes to mind, whatever say. But for me, I'm calling this section the Mac Attack. So
Ooh, the Mac Attack. Okay.
the Mac
Ready
Attack.
or not?
We brainstormed that word earlier today. Thank you, Brad. So the Mac Attack. All right. So the first thing, what's the one thing that we need to know about your work with multi-generational workforces?
that people are at the heart of everything we do, and we are our best selves when we're in community.
I love that. That's so perfect. Okay. Next. What does healthy collaboration look like to you?
Healthy collaboration looks like commitment, respect, listening well, and being willing to be wrong.
I love that. All right. What's a book or podcast that you're into right now?
Well, I have to give a shout out. My favorite podcast to listen to is Armchair Expert with Dax Shepard and Monica Padman. If you ever see this, I'm a huge fan. So I love the breadth of expertise of different people that they bring in, and they're so accessible and really interesting and care about real world issues. So I love listening to Armchair Expert. And also there's several spinoffs. So I enjoy listening to all of them.
I love it. All right. Next question. What are your hopes and plans for this next season?
So my hopes and plans for this next season involve officially launching a business, being able to share more publicly what we're doing with work, and then actually being able to take all this knowledge and the skills that I have and help organizations be more successful in onboarding Gen Z, supporting them, and then just overall working with a multi-generational workforce. I'm really passionate about it. It's kind of a weird niche to say, I wrote a dissertation on Gen Z,
right.
But I did, and I love them, and I know that they're going to do amazing things in the world. They already are, and so I want to be able to help organizations work with them really well.
I love it. All right, and then last question. If you could see any artist in concert tonight, who would it be?
Coldplay.
Yes. Yes. I've heard.
That's such a good question.
I've heard that, and specifically tonight, like you're going there from this podcast.
I would literally go right now to a Coldplay concert.
I've heard, I haven't been, and I hope they do a tour,
again,
before it's too late for them. I don't know.
Well, they're doing the Music of the Spheres concert.
Okay.
They were in the United States last year, so I actually got to see them in Pasadena at the Rose Bowl in October. They're currently doing the global tour, so they've been in Europe this summer.
I love it.
But if I could hop on a plane and go see them at their next place,
I've got to go. I'll be right there with you. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Liz Robertson, Gen Z aficionado, generational strategist, and leadership developer. I love you so much. And we've had such a long, loving relationship, and it's so great to see the work you're doing. And thank you for being my very first guest on this podcast. We're going to do amazing things, and I appreciate all your insight and wisdom.
Thank you so much for having me on. I am honored to be on here, and I am so proud of you and your curiosity and the ways that you have learned and grown. And I know you're going to continue to do incredible things to make this world a better place. I'm really proud of you.
Thank you so much. All right. Well, that's a wrap on mackCHAT, and we'll see you next time. Bye. It's like, how do you end that? I didn't think about that. I didn't think about